Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, I'm joined by Ryan Van Loan, author of The Sin in the Steel. This debut fantasy adventure sets a Sherlockian teenage street rat investigator and her troubled ex soldier partner against political intrigue and violent piracy. In a world where pistols and steel compete with mad mages and vengeful gods, Buc and Eld are sent to solve a tangled mystery that threatens to destabilize trade and society. But each are haunted by failures from their past, and their present, full of meddlesome dead gods and ship sinking pirate queens, doesn't look too promising either. The Sin in the Steel is available now from TOR Books. Ryan, welcome to Fictitious.
Adrian, thanks for having me. This is awesome.
It's really fun to get you on here because I think it's really interesting talking to authors right now, debut authors, particularly in the era of COVID, of all the stuff that's going on. Doing all these digital speaking engagements rather than a lot of the traditional ways you would think that you would be doing stuff. For you right now, what does that look like? What is um, the debut author experience? Because as we're talking, this book has been out for a few weeks now. I think maybe end of July. Was that right?
Yeah, end of July, July 21st. So, yeah, a little bit, not too long though.
Yeah. So what's that
Um,
been like for you getting started? Because I mean, this is a Tor Books release, so a major publisher, but in a weird time. So yeah, what's that experience been like?
yeah, it's been wild. I thought that 2020 was going to be, my year, and it's been different. But Tor's been really good about it. So, we didn't do any in-person events. Obviously, that's kind of been ixnayed. But leading up to this, Tor did a TorCon, a virtual con, and they invited me to participate in there. They got me on a Read Pop Metaverse panel, and I did a virtual Balticon, which, because it was virtual, they opened it up to, a couple hundred people, which is way more than I would have gotten if I had been in person. An in-person con like that, 20 to 50 people in a room is a pretty good sized crowd. So, from a numbers perspective, I've probably been in front of more people than I would have been traditionally. But from an interaction perspective, I'm just talking to a screen or to my fellow panelists. I don't get to see anybody. I don't get to gauge reactions. And I don't get that in person. I really enjoy author events. I'm a reader first and an author second. And so I really enjoy going out and seeing authors read from their book, talk about, what inspired them, questions and answers, and not getting to do that has been a bit painful. But tour's been great. I can't really complain. I've done a bunch of bookstore events, and Gibson Books actually sent me a bunch to sign and then took them back, which was really cool. So I can't complain about that. I think we're making the best out of a bad situation, and I'm not sure if anyone really has a solid sense of what the best way to reach readers is right now, but we're trying.
It's definitely it's a weird moment in time to try to figure out how to solve these kinds of problems. I mean, traditionally authors, especially like when you're doing the debut, you're doing book tours, you're showing up trying to do signings and speaking and all that kinds of stuff, um and I think a lot of authors end up like sitting at random small bookstores, kind of talking to two or three people an hour or something as they filter in. It's just this kind of like this unusual experience until you get some heat, until you get a big readership, or unless you're at a local store where people kind of already have sort of a built-in buy-in for you. That stuff can be tough. And then now, yeah, like you get this very different version where you're talking to maybe way more people, but at the same time, without that give and take, there's something different about not being able to just put the book in their hands. There was somebody that I had talked to on a different interview at one point where they said one of the troubles of this era is that like without conventions and with in-person appearances and things like that, like trying to get people to buy stuff can be tough because in like a live setting, you put the book in their hand and they're liable to give you money, or there's that sense of urgency or that sense that they're getting it directly from you. Versus in the digital age where they can open up a tab and put open their bookstore or put open Amazon or whatever like that, and then they might go do something else and come back and hem and haw on it, and like, and sooner or later they can forget about it or just, close it out. So it's tough, making that one-to-one connection and getting it done. So you have my sympathies, because it's such a weird time to do it. But on the flip side of it, like, this book is really, really cool. Let me get it in frame here. I think it's always got to be super exciting to be the debut author, to have, like, the nice hardcover make the appearance on the scene. Have you actually had the chance to get into a bookstore and see it on the shelf?
So I did actually. I live in a semi-rural area, and after the recession, we lost all our local bookstores. So local to me is about a 40-minute drive to a Barnes and Noble. But
Oh.
they, yeah, but they had a few. So I wasn't going to. I had kind of made my peace with it. I was like, I don't need to see my book on the shelf. I'm really just glad that it's out there. And then day of, I made a liar out of myself. And my wife had called ahead, kind of without me knowing, had called ahead, found out that they had a few copies, and she was like, "Why don't I drive you up there and we'll sign them?" So it actually was really cool to see it on the shelf. One of my big authors was Robert Jordan, and so they actually had that release of his first book, Warriors of the Altai. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but that was on the shelf very close by to it, so it was in frame when I was getting the picture, and that made it all worth it. I was like, okay, I don't need anything else. Like, if nobody else buys it, I was on the same shelf as Robert Jordan. I'm cool.
Right. It's all about being in good company, right? Like, that's, when you go and you see it shelved and it's next to all those names, and that idea that it can sort of exist in perpetuity in that space is very, very exciting. At the top of this, I gave kind of my quick rundown of what this book is about. Can you, in your words, kind of break down what this story is about, and like who are these two characters that it primarily follows?
Yeah, you did a great job of hitting all the high points. I mean, I normally talk about it as a Sherlockian teenager who's trying to upend her corrupt society with her suspiciously good swordsman partner in crime solving, Eld. And they find themselves blackmailed essentially into solving a mystery that empires have failed to solve. Why ships are disappearing in the far-flung reaches of the world. And they find themselves facing mages and pirate queens and the undead, and then the gods get involved. And the gods, unfortunately for Buck, have plans for her. Unfortunately for the gods, Buck has plans for them, and mayhem ensues. But yeah, it's at its heart, I think it's adventure fantasy. Buck is a pretty harsh heroine, especially in the beginning, because she's a street rat. She grew up on the streets, and she's a product of that environment. But really, it's also about found family, and that heart starts to show through, I think, as we get to know her and Eld better, and their adventures ensue.
So I really want to dig into those two characters, because I mean, I think a lot of, a good buddy adventure is, the strong dynamic duo is always a draw. I know you actually just wrote an article for Tor.com not too long ago, just examining some of the the best duos in fiction, and so I really want to dive into Buck and Eld and kind of talk about them more. But first, I want to like kind of learn a little bit more about the world, especially for people who are kind of discovering this for the first time. This is a sort of pirate fantasy, I guess, maybe genre wise. So you do have pistols. You have a certain level of magical engineering. Like, some of the boats are powered in this. I don't want to call it steampunk, but it's got a little bit of that touch maybe to it. But then there's also some big fantasy. Like, there's dead, vengeful gods and mages and a lot of other stuff going on. So can you kind of like give us like kind of the overview of like what this world is, what the setting looks like, what the feeling and tone of it is?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely pirates involved in this one. It's Age of Sail, Age of Mercantilism. It's sort of like Pirates of the Caribbean meets Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes, is how I've been describing it. From a setting perspective, it's a little non-traditional. I've always been fascinated by cultures and areas of the world that are melting pots. And melting pot tends to be a nice term, but honestly, that's where a lot of conflict comes into play, because there's sharing of radically different ideas and trade and all sorts of things. And so a couple of those areas are the Mediterranean, the Umayyad Empire in southern Spain and northern Africa, and the Caribbean. And so this world has flavors and bits and pieces of all of those. And I lived as a child in Puerto Rico for a few years. I've been all over the Caribbean. We go back often, not currently, but in pre-pandemic times, and so it's just a place that I love, and I haven't seen a lot of that in fantasy. I think we're seeing more and more, which is great, but I haven't seen a lot of it. And honestly, who doesn't love like swashbuckling tales? So all of those kind of played into it. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot going on beneath the surface as well. There's trading companies, and with that, any sort of end stage capitalism, you start to get that sort of corruption element to it. The gods themselves are also another layer to this, and there's warring factions and things like that. So our characters are kind of put into this world where there's a lot of conflict going on beneath the surface, even though above the surface it might look like smooth sailing. That's not quite the case.
Yeah, I would say definitely no smooth sailing going on in this one. I always think it's interesting whenever you have fantasy that also has that has like pistols and gunpowder and things like that. I mean, I think you add this extra layer of complication. Like magic is tough enough, and but sometimes just kind of your get out of jail free card for fixing issues. But when a character just has a gun, sometimes they can just take care of business. So I think that can always kind of, I don't know, create a little bit of a challenge in your world building, and putting that together. But also at the same time, it's fun. I mean, there's a thing I've always thought about, like in X-Men, where everybody's running around using their superpowers, and a lot of times I'm like, why don't they just have a rifle? Like, wouldn't it be helpful if one of them was just like, yeah, I mean, I can shoot you with my eye beams, but I brought a grenade too. I don't know. No, probably the long-term
Totally.
musings of too much sci-fi and fantasy, but it's always that, like, you like always bring a backup, right? That kind of idea. Um,
For sure.
in this one, I mean, you mentioned the gods and stuff in there. You do have mages running around here, so you have this, like gun and sword kind of world. And again, like you said, very kind of Pirates of the Caribbean, with a little bit of the fisticuff elements, like you said, Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes. I mean, the tonality that's right there. Um, what's the role of like mages in this world? How do they interact with both like the military and the political system? And what kind of interaction do Buck and Eld, as our POV characters, have with them? Because clearly there's a little bit of a complicated history for them.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so there's two different religions in the world. There's the dead gods who, like the name implies, are dead. Um, but their skeletons are left behind, their viscera has been left behind, and they're massive. There's actually entire cities that we get to see later on in the series that are constructed around their fallen bodies. And so, they've been around for the dawn of time, as long as anyone can remember. And there's an entire religion grown up around them. By consuming their blood, they're able to take on different powers and do different things. And so that was kind of the bedrock of society up until, we find out in the book a couple hundred years prior to this. A new god came on the scene, and she's very much alive. And so, while the dead gods kind of took on this older persona of, they have churches and cathedrals, and people come to worship, and you can be healed, if you're a follower of theirs. And so that's how they've maintained their presence in the world. This new goddess is much more of, maybe a Silicon Valley entrepreneurial type. And so she very quickly realizes that her mages are different. They use mind magic. They're able to communicate over long distances. And so that has a natural thing that a military would be interested in, especially in a wired civilization where you could be able to communicate via long distances. Same thing with trade. And so she's able to ingratiate herself and her followers into the power structure in this world in a way that the dead gods never could and never really were interested in doing so, because they never had any competition. And so that has spawned sort of this hidden civil war, that's raging in the world. And there's no spoilers there. We find that out in basically the first two chapters. Um, and so that's kind of the roles that they play. Buck, I said that she's looking to upend her corrupt society. She is also a voracious book reader, and she's read a lot of theory on why the world is the way it is. Growing up in the streets, her main goal really is to prevent anyone else from growing up like her, because she knows that she's flawed. She knows that she's incredibly harsh and broken, and she doesn't want anybody else, any other child, to grow up that way. And so she sees the gods squarely as owning a large part of this corruption, because they are able to influence the society in meaningful ways, and they've chosen to do so for their own ends rather than to help everyone. So, that sounds really altruistic, but at the same time, like I said, she's pretty harsh. The ends are always going to justify the means for her, and she's definitely Machiavellian, especially when we first meet her.
Well, let's dive a little bit more into Buck here then. So, I mean, you have a character. She's I want to say 17,
Yep.
and has grown up on the streets. Had a sister who she lost along the way, which is a very formative experience for her. She does have, like, said several times, like this sort of Sherlockish, kind of like mind, in the sense that she's a problem solver first and foremost. But like you said too, she's not super likable. She's got a very harsh personality, and she comments in her own POV often about the fact that she doesn't experience emotions in the same way that a lot of other people do. It struck me a little bit that she felt a bit neurodivergent, in the sense that empathy is kind of lacking. She's got a big worldview, but she's got a brain that operates so fast that she has to slow it down sometimes. And I'm ADHD, and so and I kind of get that concept, as far as like having a mind that is racing ahead of how you can control it. So she's got a methodology for dealing with that. And can you kind of talk about that? And then just, talking about like how she's wired as a person and operating in this world, and how that puts her at odds with other people.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, she is often the smartest person in the room. She would believe that she's always the smartest person in the room. And she's hyper intelligent. Honestly, writing her was a challenge, because I would have to I'm not that smart, so I'd have to think like, okay, if I had all the time in the world, what would the solution be that I would come up with? What she doesn't have, and what gets her into trouble, is wisdom, right? So a reviewer compared her to Alexander Hamilton, and I didn't see it until then, but like, I've read his biography, and they do have a lot of similarities. He was not able to stop himself from pointing out how wrong somebody else was, or how right he was. Even though if he had stopped just short, he probably would have got what he wanted. And she's the same way. She'll burst right through that. And Yeah, so that's a lot of fun to play with. The other thing, though, is, and I have heard from people who have ADHD, that they see themselves in her, which I think is great. I didn't set out to make her specifically like that, but I do like to write characters in such a way that hopefully folks can see themselves in those characters in a myriad of different ways. And that's not by writing by the numbers or anything at all like that, but it's just by writing the diverse world that we actually live in. And so, yeah, so she self-medicates. Like, I know many people with ADHD do self-medicate, and sometimes they're able to find a doctor and a prescription that works for them, but sometimes not, and it can be a rough journey. And so there's a leaf in their world called Khan, and it has many different properties. It's kind of almost a cross between marijuana or cocaine, depending on how it's ingested. And so she uses it to slow her brain down, so that she doesn't get so distracted by all the different thoughts going on that she doesn't get anywhere. Also, it makes it difficult for her to communicate with other people, because she gets so frustrated that they're so slow. And so this, she says in the book that she doesn't ever want to be so slow that she's normal, but she does want to be able to, she needs to be able to communicate and get her point across. So that's all at play there. I think I don't want to give too much away, but you're right in that when we meet her, she does have trouble with empathy. She does have trouble with feelings and things like that, because that's all been, she's seen where feelings lead in the streets. There's no room for them in her life. And so she's kind of cast them aside. Like I said, hyper intelligent, not always wise.
There's also something I think about in fantasy and sci-fi novels a lot is there's always something interesting about examining the type of weapon or tool that that a character wields, because I think it tends to say something about them. It tends to illustrate something about their sense of practicality, or how showy they are, how powerful they are. And if you look at like Doctor Who, you have the sonic screwdriver. You look at Arthur, you have Excalibur. It's like all those kinds of things. With her go-to weapon, Buck's go-to weapon is a slingshot, and a purse with pretty much just a slingshot in it and a couple of different kinds of ammunition. I think that says a lot about that character, but I'd like to kind of hear from you what you were using to illustrate about her through the use of that particular implement.
Yeah, so I mean, part of it is part of it was just that I think it's cool and fun. So that's an element. I'm not gonna lie, but yeah, you're right. She is the only one that we see in her world using that method because guns exist. So why wouldn't you use those? But she points out throughout that she can often fire more rounds from her slingshot than they can from a pistol. It's quieter, and also there's a sense of remove, and I think that we kind of get that from her, right? That she feels like she's not a part of her society. She's definitely outside of it. She's okay with it because she sees that as a way for her to leverage it to her own ends. But those are definitely, I think, some things that play into it. At the end of the day, I will say though that it's just a lot of fun writing somebody who is up against mages and the undead and pirates and whipping a slingshot around. And I think a few times folks in the book are surprised by that.
Well, I think that's part of the fun of it, is that it feels like a very innocuous kind of thing. Like it looks like a child's toy, right? You don't think of a slingshot
Mm-hmm.
as like a legitimate weapon in battle. There's a scene early on in the novel where there's a mage who literally shapeshifts and becomes this big like magical bull type creature and just wreaks havoc in this scene. And she's able to very carefully apply a silver bullet to basically to the nose in order to drive it off. Doesn't kill it, doesn't take it out. And I don't feel this is too spoilery because we're fairly early in the novel. But again, it gives the drop on something that otherwise some of the other people in the room with guns or swords or whatever aren't able to. And I like that element. And again, I think it always says something about the character, and I think that's a fun element of who Buck is. Then on the flip side, her companion is Eld, and Eld is I think 19, and he's sort of
Yep.
like a veteran of ongoing conflict, and has even like, it's one of those worlds where like they've kind of gone through so many soldiers that you end up having a lot of very young people on the front, sometimes in leadership positions, and he's gone through something awful and been the only person to escape it. So what can you kind of tell us about Eld's origins in this world, and why and how he ended up like at the side of Buck?
Yeah, so I mean, Eld is an interesting character. I wanted a foil for Buck who, is a little bit more self-aware of who they are and what they're capable of. And at an early age, he's exposed to what other people are capable of and realizes what he is. And so, he's much more polite than she is, polite to a fault in some respects. But that's because he knows what it's like when he loses control or when other people lose control and the situation gets out of hand. Because, like you alluded to, he has a military background that we start to see and uncover and discover, and so that's really influenced him and his position. And so, there was that aspect to it. I think another thing too is just that. Obviously, I come from a military background. I was in the infantry for 6 years, and so that's a large part of it. I wanted to be able to explore that a little bit through somebody else. Now, Buck or Eld's experiences are not anything like my own, but to be able to see that in fiction, I think again it gets to that wider viewpoint. And oftentimes, the soldiers that we or the fight scenes that we see in fantasy, we see the action element. We don't always see what the aftermath is and what the impact of the character is. So I wanted to start a character who they've already been through that, and now they're coming out the other side.
Yeah, I think that's something I think being addressed in fiction now. That idea of like PTSD of the challenges that people face after that. I mean, like my father was Bronze Star Infantry for the 45th Division, and I grew up with him having nightmares every night, and all the stuff he went through because he saw active duty, and so I mean, I grew up with that awareness that like these things leave scars. They leave damage, and it's not always really visible to everybody else. Eld also kind of has a standing grievance with somebody from that history as well. So like, how does that motivate him? Because like, you've got a couple of scrappy characters from the streets essentially who've kind of gotten placed into, not exactly blackmailed, but pretty close to it, into a situation where they have to serve this trading company and basically serve the state in order to, uh, apply this expertise. But they got into it because they were in a tough place where they could have been executed for something that happened. And so I think it's an interesting situation because both sides are leveraged in this moment, which leads them on, into this. But Eld has to have a pretty good reason to spend this time with Buck and to put himself in some of these dangerous situations. And he's clearly the muscle of the group, but not the brain. But so like, what about that combination works? What about them makes sense? And obviously he tempers that like poor sense of discipline that Buck
Hmm.
has. And that's got to be pretty vexing. But yeah, like I mean, for you as a writer, like what was the fun of writing those two characters together, and how did you kind of balance them versus each other?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of what you said is true. They do, just by their personality types, do tend to balance each other out. Eld wants to think things through. He wants to take a very measured approach. He's regimented. Uh, Buck is much more fly by the seat of her pants. She, trusts in her own intelligence to see her through. So when she sees the plan and the way forward, she's ready to go. Eld's a little bit more cautious. And I think again that's because of her background has been on the streets. If you hesitate, you die. His background has been, if you don't plan things through, bad things happen. And so the two of them together, have these kind of opposites attract type of quality. I think what he sees in Buck though, because he does put up with a lot of her abuse and he is the muscle and she gets them into some pretty tight situations, is I think both characters have regrets and we learn what those are as the story unfolds, and he sees his relationship with her as a way to maybe amend for past mistakes. So he understands what her goals are, he believes in those goals, if maybe not the way that she's going to go about achieving them. And I think that this is a chance at redemption for him, for things that he wasn't able to fix in the past.
And then what are they up against here? Because there's, I mean, like any kind of story that has mystery and intrigue and a lot of tangled things happening together, you have some forces that are kind of working with them, but also kind of against them. You have this character called the Widowmaker, this pirate queen that is also significant in here. And there's some other supernaturally kind of complications on the way in the story as well. So without giving away kind of too much, like what are our dynamic duo up against here?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning of the story, they think there's just a mystery about why ships are disappearing, and they throw out a bunch of different reasons about what could be going on there. One of those, ends up proving out to be accurate, they think. But then again, there's layers to this. So I think any good mystery, like I grew up reading Agatha Christie and things like that. What I loved about her mysteries, and I don't know if it's true, I've heard that she always wrote them that anybody could be the murderer up until the very end, and then she would just give like one more added emphasis for why the murderer was who they were. This isn't quite what I was doing here, but I do love mysteries where there's kind of a twist within a twist. And so we see through their eyes, Buck and Eld's eyes. They think they know what they're getting into, and then all the signs seem to point that way. So whether it's the weather or pirates or other trading companies, they think they're getting into that. But like I said at the beginning of this, they find themselves facing all sorts of mages and undead, and the gods get involved. So it quickly spirals out of control and well past that, and they find themselves, I think, way above where they thought they were going to be going into this.
I think I always like when a fantasy adventure layers on WTF moments, where it's like okay, this feels straightforward. oh no, I was wrong. Oh no, I was really wrong. Oh crap, I was super wrong. That kind of thing where like there's
Totally.
always another twist and always another new element layered on, but it makes sense and it's cohesive within the world, which is I think, can be a difficult thing to pull off to, constantly layer those things in and make it so that the world stays cohesive and it's not like just kind of gotcha moments. And I think that can be a challenge. Something you mentioned there, you're talking about like seeing through these characters' eyes too. Something this came up in my last interview when I was talking to Andrea Stewart, because there was a similar structure in her book in the sense that you have sort of a mixed POV. You have uh, Bucks is first person and first person limited, and then Eld and then a few other characters are third person and third person limited. And it feels to me, and I could be wrong about this, but it feels like this is something, a structure I'm seeing more commonly appear now, like a mix of that. I felt like kind of back in the day, you really got a first person POV leading an entire story with maybe a few like, sort of narrator cuts where you'd have like a sort of an omniscient narrator, or you get just third person limited head hopping between characters. So now this is a mix. I'm seeing it become more common. What made you choose that, and what kind of tools did that give you for putting the story together?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm not sure if I had seen that particular thing when I first started writing the story, the first initial draft of it. I might have, but I was certainly familiar with, like you said, your first person limited all the way through, or you're a really tight third person and you're head hopping, and that's what I had written up until that point. But when I was telling the story, I just I really realized that with Buck, there was going to be a lot more going on than what she was able to see. And I think, the choices I was making were to hopefully give us more of an idea of what was coming. So building some suspense there. Also, it's a way for us to see more about the world and learn more things. And Eld, was really a companion to her, and we were only seeing him through her eyes. And so what I also wanted to do is flip the tables and let us see what other people see when they look at Buck, because otherwise we're just seeing her through, unless she's going to look in a mirror and describe herself, and that's been done and not well. So
Yeah.
so so I think it allows you to play around with the form a little bit. I don't think there are any rules in writing. I think if it works well and adds to the story, then folks are willing to follow anything. And we're starting to see some really great examples of POV, like N.K. Jamison's fifth season, which switches POV multiple times from, I think it starts in second, and it's just so powerful. And Kate Elliott just did that with Unconquerable Sun, and so I think we're seeing it more and more. I know some folks really prefer one or the other. I think that this just has a nice blend to it, so that's what I was going for.
I like that you mentioned that idea of like letting the characters see each other rather than kind of doing that. I don't know. I like you said, there's a lot of like first person novels where somebody's got to go and kind of they've got to describe themselves to you, and it feels painful, like it's super cringy whenever it happens. Uh, you mentioned Robert Jordan earlier, and I felt like when I read like the Wheel of Time books when I was a teenager, that was one of the things I kind of really noticed about that book is that he let the characters like do the work opposite each other to kind of give you a sense of how they felt from the outside. I think Joe Abercrombie does a really good job of that, like in the first Law trilogy, where you have characters that like some people see them like, I don't know if you've read those books, but like the Bloody Nine, where like
Yep.
everybody's terrified of him, and then you see him from the inside, he's just panicking all the time, just completely terrified every moment of every day, but from the outside he looks very surly. And I love that interplay. I love getting that sense of seeing
Hmm.
the outside in and then and doing that. So I really like that how you handled that here. I like hearing Buck's voice because I think there is something to be said for allowing her to kind of explain who she is in her own words, knowing very well that this is a character that like if you met her in real life it would take a lot to warm up to because she'd be challenging. um
For sure.
uh, when you're putting this together, are you an outliner? You a pantser, discovery writer, mix of them? Like, what's your go-to for for writing and structuring?
So the idea is always natural. I never sit down and think, okay, I'm going to create a story today. Typically, what will happen is a character will just pop into my head, normally through a line of dialogue. telling me something about themselves. And then as that character voice develops inside my head, I'll start to get a sense for who they are. That sense will kind of dictate what type of world we're talking about roughly, and maybe some sense of what they want, which starts to give me vague hints of a story. At that point, when I start to get excited about it, then I sit down, and I'm actually a very structured outliner. I have, and if we want to, we could totally get into how I break down a book, but I get very structured from that point on. So character, organic story, pretty structured.
Well, yeah, let's dig into that breakdown. I mean, are you using like one of the, I mean, there's all those different methodologies as far as like, 3 and 4 act structures and 15, 17 beats, 7 point, I don't know, there's all kinds of things. So like, what's your kind of
Yeah.
go-to, and yeah, like how do you do it? Cause that's the real weeds we want to get into with this show. So yeah, what's your methodology?
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm happy to geek out over this stuff. Um, so I do two things. I create an emotional arc, a character arc, and I use the Hollywood formula for that. Which, if folks aren't familiar with that, Writing Excuses had a really good episode on that where they break down the Dark Knight, and kind of talk through what the Hollywood formula is. But that's basically, you have your main character expresses something that they want. There's a relationship character, and then there's the antagonist who's standing in their way. And then at the end, the main character overcomes the antagonist and the reconciles the theme with the relationship character. Now that sounds really like highbrow and ethereal, and so I really recommend digging into the podcast and some other things to kind of understand more how that works from an actual mechanical perspective. But what that helps me to do is just make sure that I'm telling a character-driven story, which is really, like I said, where I start is with the character. But then what I do is, from a plot perspective, I use 7 point structure, which I learned through Dan Wells. Was lucky enough to be on the Writing Excuses, the first cruise retreat that they did, and had a couple of workshops with him one-on-one, and really love that. So that's what I use for all my books. And again, there's plenty of resources out there. If folks Google that, they can dig into it more. But you basically start at the end, and that's actually something Brandon Sanderson talked about for a long time, was how he couldn't start. And I think Victoria Schwab does the same thing. They can't start their stories until they know the ending, which is really difficult, because how can you know the ending when you don't know where you're starting from? And I resisted that for a while, but I think it is the way to go. So I will sit there for several weeks, really, and just kind of let this germinate inside my head and think about, what's the end state? What's the end look like? Once I figure that out, then I just plug it into the structure. You basically go from the end to the beginning, and then you hit a couple of the different beats in that 7 point structure, and eventually you kind of have this whole thing. So I will do that, sub-bullet it out. It'll end up being probably about 30, 35 pages in Word of bullet points through all those. And then I will go back and actually write a synopsis of that outline. And that synopsis is what I show my agent. It's what I show my editor. And it's pretty true to what I'm going to end up writing. So at that point, if there's any tweaks to be made, if folks have questions, I'll show it to some beta readers as well. That lets me kind of do my tweaking up front, so that I don't write 200,000 words and then find out that 50,000 of them were a complete waste. I always say that my first draft is really that outline synopsis that I put together. So my second draft is my first prose draft. And normally by that point, it's pretty tight. There's still going to be additional drafts after that, but it allows me to work out a lot of things, like I said before, like putting down a bunch of prose, because I'm an underwriter. I'll go back through and probably have to add more scenes and maybe tighten a few, but mostly it's going to be adding things. And so I hate cutting, and this just helps me, not do that unless I really mess something up.
There's something I like when you talk about having sort of that synopsis, that like that heavily written out thing. Something I think can be really powerful in generating kind of feedback from people, or kind of gauging whether or not a story works, is having something short like that and being able to actually just tell it to other people. whether it's with
Mhm.
your writers group or with you have beta readers that are friends or somebody that's that's close to you in real life that you can just sit and talk through it with, because there's something powerful about an oral delivery of a idea just stripped of all the crazy amounts of details, but just like this happens, these characters are this or whatever, because I think you can really quickly get a sense of whether people's eyes roll back in their heads and like that's too weird or too complicated or not interesting, or if they lean in and they're like, oh, I want this. Because generally then your writers group or your friends are going to hound you afterwards because they're like, we need this book, so shut up and stop doing whatever else you're doing and go write this thing. So yeah, I really like that. I think that's very, very cool. You mentioned that you put some of this stuff in Word. Is that your specific tool of the trade, or what other stuff do you use?
Yeah, so for the majority of my career, I was using Word. For the last few years, I've actually been using Google Docs. Because it saves automatically. It doesn't have the crashing that happens with Word, especially when, I have 3 or 4 documents open of several 100,000 words. Google Docs isn't perfect. Once you start to get past 120,000, it starts to be a little slow sometimes. It's getting better. They're getting better every time I go back to write a new story. They have new features that mimic things that Word does. But primarily I'm using that. I know a lot of folks love Scrivener. I am a little bit old school, and while I'm not superstitious, I am worried that like somehow changing the format is going to change the way that I'm approaching it. And honestly, I just don't have the time that it would take for me to dedicate to learn all the ins and outs of Scrivener and figure out what makes it so awesome. I feel like I could write half a book in that time frame, so I'd rather just write the book. It hasn't really, slowed me down. But I know all the Scrivener folks are like rolling over right now and being like, no, but if you just tried it, you would see the light. But I'm gonna be a curmudgeon and say get off my lawn.
Well, like I am a Scrivener user myself, but I do like what you said there, which is I think that the tools do reflect how you're thinking about stuff and how you approach it. And I mean, I've said this several times on the show, talking with both Scrivener users and the people who don't, because Word terrifies me. But like I'm a modular thinker, so I like moving pieces around and being able to break things up into chunks. I don't have a brain that can look at 120,000 words and go, oh, okay, cool. This works for me. That's crazy for me. I need small pieces. And so that works for me. But if you have the kind of mind that can handle all that in a linear way, and it's not daunting, like you said, like as an underwriter, like you're going in and adding things, so it's almost
Mhm.
like you've built a framework, and then you're always refining, but you're building blocks on that foundation rather than like there's there's different terms for it. I like to call it story excavation. For some
Mhm.
people, it's like more like they took a big block of stone and they're drilling down further until they can find the statue within. You sound like the opposite, where it's like you built the framework out of wire and then you're layering sculpty or something on top of it and then refining it and adding until it's done. And so it's a very different kind of thought process, and so that's what I think is interesting on the show, is just seeing how wildly different every writer approaches their stuff. And I think that's very, very cool. Before we get done with this, again, I want to reinforce that the Sin and the Steel is available in all of the places. It's in the bookstores and online, and wherever books are sold. Where should people be following you? Because this is the start of a series, and this
Yep.
does set up an ongoing with these characters. So where should people follow you online so they know when things are coming next, when they can see other stuff that you're doing? It sounds like you've been writing for a long time, even if this is sort of the first thing that fantasy readers are being introduced to. So yeah, where should we learn more about your work?
Yeah, so ryanvanloan.com is my website, RYANVANLOAN, sound spelled like it sounds. And you can find out stuff there. I post my newsletters to there. If you want to sign up for newsletters, you can kind of be the first in the know. But eventually they'll make it to my website so you can see it there. I'm on Twitter probably more than is healthy. And tag
Aren't we
handle is
all?
just my name at Ryan Van Loan, right? Especially now. Um, but I'm happy to talk to folks on there. It's always fun when readers reach out, or even writers. I love to pay it forward. So aspiring writers always happy to talk shop and my experiences, because I think there's a lot out there on the writing journey up until the point where you land an agent, and then after that it starts to peter out until by the point you get to you have a book deal and you're writing the books. What happens? There's not a whole lot out there. So I've been fortunate in that I have made friends with some pretty well-known authors who have established careers, and they've taken me under their wing. And so whenever I can pay it back, I always like to do that. I'm also on Instagram. Same thing, Ryan Van Loan. I post a lot of dog pictures, food pictures, used to be travel pictures, and also some writing stuff as well. So Twitter, Instagram, my website, those are the best places to find me.
Well, very cool. Like I said, The Sin in the Steel is in stores now from TOR Books. More coming on the way. I think this scratches that itch for people if they are looking for, like you said, sort of Sherlock meets Pirates of the Caribbean, something that's got kind of a little bit of grim dark flavor, but also a very specific sense of humor that's through here. You've got a very unique sense of dialogue and the flow of conversation between characters. I think that very quickly into it, I could see that this is a distinct writing style. People will be able to. I feel like you're one of those writers that people will know it's you when they read you, because it's there. Even reading your prose on like Tor.com, I got a sense of like, oh, you have a voice, and it's clear on the page here. So I hope people that come and pick it up. And Ryan, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This has been a blast.
Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, hit like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you took away from the conversation. Be sure to check out my previous interview with Andrea Stewart, author of The Bone Shard Daughter. And keep in mind that there are over 50 audio-only episodes of the podcast that are also available for you to enjoy here on YouTube. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for watching Fictitious.